I knew something was rotten at Apex Technical Solutions when Chloe Vance called her welcome lunch a strategic activation ceremony and tried to high-five the head of regulatory compliance. Have you ever watched an overeager puppy try to operate a commercial blender? That was Chloe, too perky, too loud, and far too eager to redefine legacy mindsets. I had been with Apex Technical Solutions for 11 years as Senior Director of Compliance and Audit Oversight. During that decade, I had survived 3 corporate restructures, 4 chief financial officers, 1 chief executive officer having a mild stroke during a quarterly earnings call, and a brief, scarring experiment with standing-only conference rooms. But nothing in my 55 years of life prepared me for Chloe in her chunky pearls and crocodile smile when she was introduced on a rainy Tuesday morning as our Special Projects Director. In corporate terms, that title essentially meant gaslight with style. They brought her into the executive suite during a company-wide reorganization so chaotic that even the organizational chart looked like a conspiracy theorist's stringboard. Our chief executive officer, Gerald Vance, stood at the podium as proud as a golden retriever, grinning like he had just personally invented sliced bread. He beamed at the assembled staff and announced that Chloe was here to help us modernize our governance framework. Nobody clapped, not because we were intentionally rude, but because every single senior manager in that auditorium had just done the quick mental arithmetic and realized Chloe shared the exact same last name as Gerald's son, Brad. She was a textbook product of nepotism, armed with a digital Master of Business Administration degree and a self-produced podcast about authentic corporate disruption. During her very first week on the job, Chloe bypassed all established protocols and requested raw audit log access. No formal ticketing system, no authorization chain of command, just a casual Slack message sent to my department saying she wanted the raw system entries from the fourth quarter to optimize operational transparency. I replied with a simple graphic interchange format image of a solid brick wall. She hearted the message, assuming I was joking. By her second week, she walked uninvited into a confidential finance committee call and began demanding metrics on vendor velocity. We do not have vendor velocity metrics. Nobody in corporate accounting even knows what that phrase means. When one of my senior analysts attempted to explain our regulatory verification process, Chloe interrupted him, declaring that we would fix that outdated mindset in the next data sprint, followed by a wink like a cartoon villain standing beside a digital task board. By the third week, I caught her making a private phone call from one of the vacant vice presidential corner offices. She had pulled the window blinds shut, but had forgotten that the mahogany door was cracked open an inch. I heard her smooth, confident voice say into her phone that she had rerouted the filings through a shell entity so Clifford would not even notice that they had paused the retrospective compliance filings. When she stepped out into the hallway moments later, her lipstick was untouched, sipping a lavender kombucha as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. That was the exact afternoon I started keeping formal notes. Not standard internal memos, because those tend to conveniently disappear during corporate reorganizations, but a dedicated file stored securely on my personal offline hard drive. I labeled the directory Unicorn Turds because titling it Official Evidence felt far too obvious. I was not being paranoid. At Apex Technical Solutions, paranoia is simply professionalism with a safety belt. You do not survive over 11 years in corporate regulatory compliance unless you understand how the building walls breathe. Chloe moved fast, far too fast for someone with zero background in corporate law or federal audit standards. Within 30 days, she had secured discretionary budget authority, launched her own dedicated internal communications channel, redesigned the corporate portal landing page, featuring herself as our governance champion, and captured the undivided attention of every executive in a blazer who mistook aggressive confidence for competence. Meanwhile, I found myself systematically uninvited from the $300 million acquisition planning meetings that I had personally spent 18 months building from the ground up. My calendar suddenly developed mysterious blank spaces. My formal compliance sign-offs stalled in administrative purgatory, When I finally flagged an unauthorized change to our primary vendor contract, my ticket was returned with a single-word comment from Chloe, noted. It was not just my immediate team that felt the creeping chill. Our payroll reconciliation was suddenly off by a full decimal point. A junior analyst reported being asked by Chloe's office to reformat vendor onboarding records from 3 years prior strictly for optics. Our vendor verification protocol, which had been locked down tight as a drum ever since a regulatory scare back in 2014, suddenly developed gaps large enough to navigate a luxury yacht through. When I mentioned these discrepancies to Chloe in passing near the executive elevator, she merely laughed. She told me they were simplifying processes for speed, adding with a soft, patronizing pat on my shoulder that I should not worry because no one would believe I was the bad guy. That was the first time she uttered those words. No one will believe you. It was delivered without obvious menace, just casual, practiced cruelty, the kind of line tossed out by someone utterly convinced that the corporate house always wins. I attempted to escalate the matter through traditional human resources channels. The HR director smiled sympathetically across her polished desk and explained that the organization was still adjusting to the new reporting hierarchy, gently informing me that my system permissions were currently under administrative review due to the ongoing restructuring. When I reached out to corporate legal, I received complete radio silence. It felt as though I was being systematically erased from the organization by someone who knew precisely which corporate strings to pull and who held the shears. Yet, I was not about to panic or burn down the building. Not yet. I needed to determine how high this corruption reached and who was actively shielding her. If Chloe Vance assumed a 55-year-old senior auditor would surrender quietly, she had clearly never bothered to read the foundational footnotes of our corporate compliance charter. The formal meeting invitation arrived in my inbox, accompanied by a glittery animated graphic of a dancing cat and a subject line that read "Coffee Chat" with a smiling face emoji. Nothing announces an impending corporate assassination quite like a calendar request that winks at you. It was scheduled for 4:45 in the afternoon, the classic corporate execution hour, late enough that most of the support staff had already packed up and gone home, yet early enough that it would not look suspiciously deliberate on an administrative log. When I walked into Chloe's corner office, she greeted me as if I were a featured guest on her lifestyle video blog. She told me to come in and sit down, gushing over my suit jacket and commenting that I always dressed like such a proper grown-up. Her office smelled strongly of synthetic rosewater and curated executive vibes, every flat surface decorated with wooden quote blocks and plastic succulents. Directly behind her glass desk hung a framed typography print that declared integrity as a vibe. I almost laughed out loud, but managed to maintain my composure. She offered me herbal tea from a ceramic mug molded in the shape of a unicorn's head, which I politely declined. She took a dainty sip, leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair, and adopted an expression like someone auditioning for a high-end perfume commercial. She told me sweetly that she understood there had been some unfortunate confusion regarding the Woomer consulting vendor file. I saw no reason to play dumb or engage in corporate pleasantries. I told her flatly that it was not confusion. I pointed out that the primary contact listed on the newly approved Woomer contract was her former undergraduate sorority sister, and that authorizing an unbidded contract with her firm without declaring the personal relationship constituted a direct conflict of interest violations under Section 4.2 of our corporate compliance charter. Her expression did not flicker. Her smile remained fixed, slow and blinkless, like a sunbathing crocodile. She cooed that we were no longer framing operational decisions in such rigid terms, explaining that the company was now operating under a modern trust-first governance model, where older frameworks were simply restrictive. I replied coldly that restrictive frameworks were precisely what kept corporate executives out of federal prison. Chloe laughed, a genuine melodious laugh, declaring that I was far too intense. Then she began tapping her manicured fingernails against her glass desktop in a steady rhythmic pattern. Click, click, click. She claimed she had never formally authorized anything, suggesting that I must have misunderstood an internal communication, which she noted happened frequently during major structural transitions. She added that to ease my mind, she would personally look into the matter. I reminded her that she had personally transmitted the digital authorization file and signed the emergency change order. She tilted her head, asking innocently if she really had, before softening her voice into a purr. She looked me straight in the eye and repeated those 5 words. "No one will believe you." 5 words, cool as an autumn breeze, delivered with the kind of casual malice that only someone born into consequence-free wealth can master. The silence that settled over the room was absolute. She knew I understood the warning, and I did, crystal clear. I walked out of her office with every muscle in my back clenched tight. By the time I returned to my cubicle, the calendar invites for 3 of my senior analysts had already been modified. They had been reassigned to report directly to a rotational manager, whom Chloe had personally appointed that morning. 2 of my team members were already packing their personal desk items into cardboard boxes, admitting quietly that they had been strongly encouraged to explore career growth opportunities elsewhere. One of them, Neil Miller, looked at me with heavy guilt in his eyes, whispering under his breath that management had explicitly instructed them not to loop me into project updates anymore. That exact same evening, my administrative access to the $300 million acquisition compliance folder was silently revoked. Gone without a trace. No help desk ticket, no advance notification. When I called the information technology help desk, the technician nervously admitted that the override command had come directly from upstream management. When I pressed him for details, he grew utterly quiet, clearly having been warned that asking questions would jeopardize his own employment. Knowing Chloe's methodology, he undoubtedly had been threatened. The following morning, I tried escalating the compliance breach through our corporate legal department. My urgent email bounced back instantly with an automated reply, stating that legal was not accepting outside submissions at this time. I was not an outsider. I was the Senior Director of Compliance Oversight, or at least I had been 24 hours ago. That was the precise moment everything clicked into place. This was not merely an ambitious executive power grab. It was a methodical, surgical purge designed to erase my authority before the acquisition audit finalized. And Chloe had planned every single detail, right down to the glittery coffee chat invitations. She expected me to walk away quietly, tail between my legs, too intimidated to speak out and too professional to cause a public scene. But she had failed to account for one fundamental reality of my profession. I write everything down. Not merely what occurred, but how it occurred, when it occurred, the exact timestamps and the subtle facial twitches of individuals who realize they have committed a crime. She did not realize that while she was busy scrubbing corporate servers, I was preparing to build a wall of evidence that no executive gaslighting could ever tear down. That evening, I drove home in complete silence, poured myself 2 fingers of neat rye whiskey, and unlocked the heavy wooden filing cabinet in the back corner of my home study. Tucked safely behind stacks of archived tax filings sat a worn, blue expanding accordion folder, wedged between an old manual hole punch and a gagged coffee mug that read "Audit me, bro." I had not opened that physical archive in over 4 years. The last time I had pulled it out was when a former head of risk attempted to approve a secret bonus payout to a board member's relative, under the guise of motivational consulting. That payout never occurred because of what sat in this folder. I called it my just-in-case repository, built for the exact scenario where corporate leadership lost their minds and attempted to perpetrate fraud under the umbrella of operational synergy. Inside were physical printed copies of flagged compliance memos, pre-edited raw data snapshots, vendor audit trails, and internal email threads I had archived purely out of seasoned auditor instinct. For 48 consecutive hours, I worked through the night on my isolated offline computer. I combed through archived system exports, legacy inbox files, and encrypted flash drives dating back several years. On an old backup drive from 2021, I discovered an archived spreadsheet titled Third Quarter Vendor Escalation Pending. Beneath a tab labeled Flagged B. Reeves, my pulse quickened. Chloe Vance had been involved in two separate vendor refresh projects back when she operated as an independent corporate consultant before she married Gerald's son and entered the executive suite. Both projects had been red flagged by internal auditing for unnaturally accelerated sign-off chains, though nothing had ever stuck because the department was distracted by a massive logistics embezzlement investigation that same fiscal year. It had been easy to bury back then, buried inside a raw text message export from a dormant administrative inbox, I located the undeniable smoking gun. It was a digital copy of an email transmitted from Chloe's private account, hosted on protonmail.com. Sent at precisely 2:12 in the morning to a third-party vendor liaison, whom she was currently attempting to push through for the $300 million acquisition. The message body contained no formal greeting and no signature, consisting of just 4 stark sentences. Just clean the books. They will never check the original vendor. Delete the retrospective purchase order chain and start fresh. We need clean optics for the closes out. You will be covered. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing monitor for a long time. This was not merely unethical corporate maneuvering or internal policy bending. This was a direct, blatant violation of federal regulatory compliance laws governing corporate acquisitions. Specifically, it constituted clear record destruction and falsification under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1519, which carries severe criminal penalties for altering documents with the intent to impede or influence a federal regulatory proceeding. Furthermore, executing such schemes across state lines via digital communications established a prima facie case of federal wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1343, as well as a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty under state corporate governance statutes. For jet internal corporate politics, this was lethal regulatory ammunition. It was the exact category of evidence that causes multi-hundred-million-dollar corporate mergers to freeze instantly in their tracks. It was the precise text that a federal regulator reads once, pauses, and then reads a second time very slowly. She had transmitted this damning directive during the exact same week she locked me out of the compliance archives, while assuring the board of directors that all vendor files were undergoing routine modern governance review. She was scrubbing paper trails with a mop soaked in bleach and vanity. I printed the email header on high-grade paper, meticulous matching the server routing codes to our internal vendor approval ledgers and tracing the sequential chain of purchase order identification numbers that had quietly vanished from our active database. I built an airtight chronological timeline on my offline hardware, cross-referencing digital sign-offs, revoked access timestamps, altered onboarding forms, and altered Slack conversation logs. Everything that appeared to be a random coincidence, I highlighted in yellow. Everything that demonstrated deliberate record tampering, I tagged in red. I did not notify anyone at the office. In corporate auditing, you never fire a warning shot in the dark. You wait patiently, align your documentation, and wait for the exact moment when the target is fully committed to their lie in front of an authoritative audience. Midway through the following week, as I was exiting a budget prep meeting, our chief financial officer, Bernard Croft, caught up with me in the marble hallway. Bernard was a 58-year-old former forensic accountant who had zero tolerance for executive fluff. He adjusted his silver spectacles and remarked quietly that I had been unusually quiet lately. I shrugged, replying that there was a great deal of noise in the building. He offered a thin, knowing smile and asked under his breath if I still maintained access to the core compliance vendor logs. I met his gaze directly, stating that while my official network access had been restricted, my documentation remained entirely intact. Bernard did not utter another word. He simply gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of his head, then turned and walked toward the executive elevators as if our conversation had never taken place. That brief exchange confirmed what I had suspected. I was not the only professional in the building who refused to swallow Chloe's glossy narratives. The initial external contact arrived late on Tuesday evening through my encrypted personal email inbox, an address I had not utilized since a major federal compliance seminar 3 years prior. The subject line read clarification request regarding 1806 filing discrepancy. The sender was an auditor named Elliot Drake from the Federal Office of Transactional Oversight. I recognized his name immediately from regulatory enforcement panels. He was a sharp young investigator known for meticulous attention to detail and zero tolerance for corporate hand-waving. His message opened with a clear legal disclaimer, noting that he was not conducting a formal enforcement action yet, but was informally reviewing supplemental vendor documentation submitted for Apex Technical Solutions pending $300 million acquisition. He noted several curious gaps in the retrospective filings and asked if I could provide historical context. I read his message twice, then immediately deleted the draft response I had begun typing. As a seasoned compliance officer, I knew better than to put informal commentary in writing that could later be twisted into claims of improper disclosure or corporate sabotage. Instead, I replied with a single precise sentence. The final regulatory acquisition audit convenes Thursday morning at 9 o'clock in the glass conference room on the 18th floor, and you will certainly want a front row seat. He did not reply to my message, nor was any reply necessary. That exact same night, a second crucial piece of evidence materialized. I received an encrypted message from Nora Kincaid, the founder and owner of Kincaid Freight Logistics. Nora's firm had handled over half of our primary freight and logistic distribution for 6 years before Chloe abruptly severed their contract mid-cycle to make room for an unvetted shell entity. Nora attached a series of high-resolution digital screenshots displaying direct text communications from Chloe's verified corporate handle. The messages explicitly instructed Kincaid Freight to backdate all third and fourth quarter purchase orders to July 15th, falsely labeling the records with legacy authorization codes to maintain consistent optics for the impending merger review. Nora added a note stating that she refused to commit perjury or falsify records for Chloe's personal vanity. Armed with Nora's statement and the raw message headers, I cross-referenced the invoice sequences across our third and fourth quarter financial ledgers. The invoice numbers were wildly out of order, yet the transaction dates had been artificially smoothed over to align seamlessly with Chloe's fabricated reporting narrative. It was like watching an amateur attempt to forge a legal birth certificate, where everyone in the family was inexplicably born on the exact same afternoon. I printed every corresponding page, bound them in a heavy black binder, labeled the tab Anomalous Vendor Chain Period B, and placed it inside my leather briefcase beside the printed Proton Mail email. Thursday morning arrived under gray, rain-swept skies. The 18th floor glass conference room smelled intensely of citrus-flavored disinfectant and cold corporate anxiety. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city's skyline, while bottled water had been arranged in precise geometric pyramids along the polished mahogany table. Printed cardstock name tents sat at each place setting. Chief Executive Officer Gerald Vance entered the room first, radiating supreme corporate confidence, greeting Federal Audit Liaison Elliot Drake with a firm handshake and the practiced charm of a veteran executive who had spent 30 years convincing boardrooms that financial losses were merely strategic investments. Gerald took the central head seat, flanked by Chloe on his right and corporate counsel Rachel Thorne on his left. Chloe was practically glowing, dressed in a tailored white power suit and carrying a thick leather binder decorated with color-coded pastel tabs. She walked into that conference room as if she owned the entire conglomerate, taking her seat with the serene posture of someone who believed her executive destiny was preordained. She opened her binder to a front tab labeled Narrative Flow. I sat 2 seats down the table, quiet, dressed in my standard gray suit, appearing completely neutral and unthreatening. I had no thick binders on display, merely my open laptop and a legal notepad. Nobody paid the slightest attention to me. Elliot Drake sat directly across from Chloe, flipping slowly through the official acquisition filing packet. For the first 15 minutes of the meeting, he did not utter a single word, turning page after page with the cold, unhurried rhythm of a federal officer waiting for someone to commit perjury. Chloe took the lead, delivering her polished presentation with characteristic sparkle, claiming that her office had modernized and curated the audit trail to ensure seamless operational alignment. Elliot raised his eyes from the paperwork, asking calmly about the purchase order reconciliation sheets for Kincaid Freight Logistics during the third quarter. Chloe smiled radiantly, stating that those records had been consolidated under Tab 7 to reflect reporting optimization as of August 15th. Elliot turned to Tab 7, paused, his brow furrowing slightly, before looking up and noting that while he possessed documentation for July and October, there was an absolute void of records between August 2nd and September 29th. Chloe blinked, claiming smoothly that the company had undergone a routine internal re-benchmarking exercise during that window. Elliot tilted his head, noting coolly that he held flag communications indicating that purchase orders had indeed been executed during those exact dates, asking point-blank why the primary transaction logs had been altered. The atmosphere inside the glass conference room turned instantly frigid. Gerald Vance cleared his throat, offering a soft, protective cough, while Chloe's bright smile began to show microscopic fractures around the edges. She attempted to laugh it off, attributing the discrepancy to legacy system lag during major structural transitions. Elliot Drake did not laugh. He slowly closed the official corporate filing binder with a firm, decisive thud that echoed against the glass walls, looking directly at Gerald before turning his sharp gaze back to Chloe. He stated in an even, unyielding voice that the missing vendor documentation and altered purchase order chains represented a material compliance gap of severe proportions, especially given the $300 million valuation of the pending acquisition. Gerald turned his head toward his daughter-in-law, his voice losing its confident boom and taking on a tight edge of caution as he asked her to explain the missing records. Chloe opened her mouth, closed it, and began stammering about administrative consolidation and modern governance strategies. I did not say a word. I did not make a dramatic speech or raise my voice. I simply unzipped my leather briefcase, retrieved the plain manila folder containing the printed Proton mail, evidence, and Nora Kincaid's verified statements, and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany table directly to Elliot Drake. The soft whisper of paper sliding against polished wood was the only sound in the silent room. Chloe's fingers twitched violently against her pastel binder, her face draining of color as Elliot adjusted his spectacles and opened the folder. For 60 agonizing seconds, complete and absolute silence descended upon the 18th floor. The only audible noise was the rhythmic tick of the wall clock above the refreshment bar, sounding precisely like an explosive countdown. Elliot read the printed Proton mail email twice, once quickly to grasp the content, and a second time painfully slowly to verify every technical header detail. He reviewed the raw metadata logs, the matching invoice sequences, and the explicit written instruction from Chloe, commanding the vendor to delete retrospective purchase order chains to ensure clean optics for the acquisition closeout. When Elliot finally raised his head, he did not look at Chloe at all. He turned his eyes directly toward Chief Executive Officer Gerald Vance and uttered 6 quiet words that shattered the room. "Is your corporate counsel present?" Those 6 words landed with the crushing weight of a sledgehammer. Gerald blinked in utter bewilderment, asking what he meant. Elliot calmly closed the manila folder, stacked it neatly on top of his official briefcase, and stated flatly that the documentation presented constituted prima facie evidence of criminal document alteration and record falsification under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1519, as well as potential wire fraud under Section 1343. He informed the Executive Committee that effective immediately, the Federal Office of Transactional Oversight was placing the entire $300 million acquisition under a mandatory provisional regulatory hold, pending a full forensic investigation by federal authorities. Provisional regulatory hold. The words hung in the air like toxic fallout. Chloe's face went completely ghostly white, her posture collapsing as her confident facade disintegrated into raw terror. Gerald slowly turned his head to look at his daughter-in-law. His eyes filled not merely with corporate panic, but with the crushing agony of personal betrayal. He asked her in a hollow, broken voice if she had altered federal compliance records. Chloe opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She could not deny it. The digital signatures, IP routing headers, and verified vendor confirmations were absolute and undeniable. Corporate counsel Rachel Thorne immediately closed her laptop, instructing Gerald and Chloe to cease speaking entirely. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, the internal communications channels across Apex Technical Solutions were in absolute meltdown. The regulatory hold had been officially confirmed. The acquisition was formally suspended, and Chloe Vance was personally escorted out of the building by corporate security officers and legal staff. She was not wearing her triumphant smile. Her white blazer was rumpled, her head was bowed, and her executive badge hung limply from her neck like a relic of a vanished empire. Her husband, Brad Vance, reportedly refused to issue any statement. Seen standing alone in the 22nd floor elevator lobby, staring blankly at the city skyline. By 1:17 in the afternoon, Chief Financial Officer Bernard Croft walked into my office bullpen. He stopped beside my desk, looked down at me with profound respect, and quietly thanked me for holding the line. When the entire executive suite had succumbed to vanity, he immediately authorized the complete restoration of my department's administrative permissions, reinstating my analysts Neil Miller and Gwen Albright to their original roles. I did not take a victory lap, nor did I post triumphant messages on internal forums. I simply accepted my restored access, opened a fresh heavy-duty binder, labeled the front tab Post-Disruption Integrity Controls, and resumed my work. People like Chloe Vance never understand that corporate compliance is not about bureaucratic red tape or slowing down progress. Compliance is institutional memory, the unyielding, immutable record of who signed what, when they signed it, and why. It is the silent armor that protects an organization when vanity and entitlement attempt to substitute arrogance for truth. Chloe believed that by deleting system files and gaslighting senior staff, she could rewrite reality and force the corporate world to submit to her terms. But in the end, her downfall was not brought about by office gossip or political maneuvering. It was executed by her own written words, documented, dated, verified, and preserved forever in black and white.